we will be talking about Sipatlawin's work on site specificity and cultural relativity as articulated by Sarah in her thesis for us. And eventually at the end of the presentation, we will be talking about where we aim to go after 3 years of doing groundwork to everyone. So here's Sarah.
Hello. Again, I'm Sarah. I'm the resident performance curator and dramaturg of the Sipatlawin Ensemble. I recently graduated from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, with a degree in art studies. So there, my thesis was about cultural relativism in site specificity, talking about Sipatlawin's practice towards creating and sustaining a theater community. And I graduated April. And I think after just a few months, even my sensibilities changed. That when I read it, they asked me to present a paper during the conference in the Mabuhay Temple. I realized that this isn't exactly what we have right now in terms of orientation, because we already went on from it. So what I will be doing is, apart from summarizing my thesis, is just to slowly transition the conversation to where Sipatlawin is at right now. So, yep, cultural relativism in site specificity and creating a contemporary theater community. So here I talk about 3 key points. It's about site specificity, which is the general practice that deals especially with performance, as I'm pertaining to that. Here, and cultural relativism, which is an anthropological approach that we've been able to adapt and imbibe in our practice. I actually have a slideshow, but we don't have a projector. So I use those 2 key ideas to talk about the work, which in site specificity is made up of artist, audience, and space. Yep. So I also recognize the idea of having a theory of practice. Practice meaning the conception to the process, to the exposition, having that actual work, and theory of practice instead of theories. In theory of practice meaning that practice and theory is quite balanced, and not theorizing before actually practicing, or practicing then talking or making theories about it afterwards. So site specificity, what I did then, because site specificity in performance is a relatively new practice, from the books that I've read, especially Mike Pearson's site-specific performance, it says that it's actually the awareness that there is a site-specific performance movement, as they would like to say it, happened just in the past decade, so just roughly 10 years. But where it came from, generally, was the site specificity in the visual arts, which started probably in the 1970s or 1960s. So just with that awareness, just to figure out where it came from, what I did was take one of books on site specificity in the arts, which is very visual arts oriented. It was Mi Won Kwon's One Place After Another, Site-Specific Art and Locational Identity. Then paralleled it to Mike Pearson's Site-Specific Performance, just to see how this movement developed and how site specificity in performance developed. From my learnings, I just realized that there were actually 3 paradigmatic shifts that happened. First, there's the phenomenological or experiential paradigm, crossing over to the social or institutional paradigm, then to the discursive paradigm. So these 3 main paradigms are, of course, always present in whichever era, but one highlights, one specific paradigm is highlighted every so often. So what happened in the site specificity in the visual arts with that 1970s, with the spur of minimalism, I think it came from that, and then eventually works crossed over to conceptual art, and then eventually public installations were made. So that was the time when the phenomenological approach was highlighted with actual paintings extending out of the frames in galleries, and artworks extending out of the windows of the actual galleries, and eventually works were presented outside these gallery spaces. What was then acknowledged was the structure, art's relation to the physical site, inhabiting the site as place, and the viewer's physical presence as important to it. So what the viewer felt while the work is there, while seeing the work and not just looking at it and intellectualizing the whole process or looking at the semantics. It was the first time that it was acknowledged that the feeling, the affect, was quite important to the experience of the work. So eventually, a decade after, things crossed over to the social or institutional paradigm, where the context and the content of the work was also explored, how it meaning making brought by the space, the actual sites, actually informed what the work was. So art and the art world or art institutions was acknowledged then, site as a cultural framework, and the audience acknowledged as a social being. So it was art and society, site as a space, the site's function, its history, what it was and what it meant to the present communities there was acknowledged. And of course, involved there were the people, the actual people who existed in those sites, and what they thought about the sites, and what the people who were introduced to the sites also thought about it. So then context of the people, not only the places, were highlighted. And eventually, just in 2000, it said that the discursive paradigm already acknowledged that art could define the space and not the space defining the art. It twisted the idea of it. So site was acknowledged as space, meaning a functional site where relationships are created. So it crossed over from the physical site to, for example, the internet, where online sites, or actually a phone call as a site, because you create connections through that. So these weren't physical material. It just addressed the idea of the site. So if in the visual arts, because that was the general development, if in the visual arts it was the artwork, the space, and the audience. For performance, it was the artist, the space, and the audience, considering that the work is not just a performance, but an event that involved the people there as well. So what happened in the performance portion, it was a very similar transition from acknowledging the structure, or having the phenomenological paradigm with Peter Brook and theater of cruelty happening in the early 1900s. Is it right? Around 1960s. Yep, as early as that. And then eventually transitioning to a social or institutional context, which usually was an anti-institutional context, rebelling from the system, rebelling from the conventional or the mainstream then, and using art to it. It was also, of course, acknowledging site as a participant, a symbol, a storyteller in its own right. And of course, it started, performances then started to address accessibility, because from before that you were actually inviting people to go to the theaters, you are now going to these spaces and introducing what you have to the communities there. So it was acknowledged then that this has to be understood by the communities within that specific space, because by going site-specific, it transitioned from just doing a performance in a different place and reimagining the site to doing a performance in a place specifically for the people there. And eventually, slowly, it transitioned to the discursive paradigm just in the last 10 years or so, acknowledging site as the discursive space, the fluid space, which addressed mobilities, acknowledged all these other, phenomena that has been happening, globalization, etc., etc. And it acknowledged that site or the space is made up of very dynamic relationships and a particularity of mixtures. So from actually being very site specific, as in concentrating on one thing, it's now about acknowledging the multiplicity of points of view, from being very particular to being very pluralistic. So from learning about all those ideas on site specificity, I tried to parallel it with cultural relativism, the anthropological approach by Franz Boas, as he articulated it in 1896 with what he wrote, The Limits of the Comparative Method of Anthropology, which was considered then a modern social scientific paradigm for the study of mankind. So with the Sipatlawin, cultural relativism is seen as a point of view, safer method, inductive and holistic, to studying factors, that is physical, internal, historical, detrimental to the growth of societies and cultures. And by cultures, I mean the phenomenon formed, lived, and sustained by a collective of people who share beliefs, customs, traditions, and or ways, and at that share a history. So site specificity and cultural relativism has both been, because when we started the company in 2010, I jump off briefly to the history of CPAT. The general instinct was to just work in different sites, and we weren't really aware of site specificity and its development. We weren't aware of site specificity as a theory at all. Yes, so it was something that organically came up, and even cultural relativism, when we actually encountered the whole term and embraced it. Before that, apparently we've been practicing what it was. So I think that was really last year when we started to realize that, this is what we've been doing, and apparently other people have been thinking about these things. So yeah, it was quite a big jump up, because the general when we went through the whole history of site specificity and looking at how cultural relativity seems to be the kind of practice that it called for, that the practice of site specificity called for, and that when in other countries it took 30 years to develop, looking back at CPAT's history, we realized that we went through all of the paradigmatic shifts in 3 years. So it was actually a fast development, embracing all those things. So just to now give you the history of Sipatlawin and our works. So now we define Sipatlawin as an edgework, site-specific performance company engaged in ensemble and collaborative work towards developing a shared contemporary community theater experience among artists and audiences inside and or outside the four walls of the theater. That's a long time. So like Jay introduced before, most of us are graduates, not all, most of us are graduates of the Philippine High School for the Arts. We were theater arts majors. I'm sorry, let me just, yep. We were theater majors then, and as we say, we are classically trained. We were trained to perform with using conventional methods, classical methods. So at the start of CPAT, what happened? Do you want to talk about this, since you were so involved in that age? Because I was really young then.
So in 2009, we were all freelancers performing for different companies in Metro Manila, and it was because we were working for different companies doing different jobs. We realized that it's just us who work together most of the time. So and also there was we regularly meet once a year to create like a reunion production, so that you just do the things that you want to do, and things that you think are relevant to your immediate environment, society. And then eventually, because we had this part discontent, because it was in 2010 that there was, we were performing for different theater companies, and there was this big elections coming in May, and there were this big political unrest in Manila, and we are theater artists, and we don't have facilities to express or even to say what we want and to make our works even relevant. We cannot do it with any other companies because, of course, you have patrons and or all your corporate support. So, na. And that was the age when, that was a time when we had an elections where you get to choose between evil and lesser evil. And we're talking about that, and we say, why don't we just scrap everything and like go back to the basics of the theater? It's actor action audience, and in Manila, if you want to do a performance in a conventional space, you have to be renting it like 40,000 pesos, and all the costs for lights and prices will rise, minus the rehearsal costs, and at the same time, that will leave your artist not really getting paid because we're also spending for other expenses. So okay, so let's scrap everything, and we have stories to tell, we have images to share, and then so let's do it. So we looked for alternative spaces. First, we performed in bars, then in living rooms of friends, and at first we were doing still like modern plays. We did Bent, about the Bent, which was translated in Filipino. Bent is a play about the Holocaust, about gay men in Holocausts, and we were doing this play about waitresses in bars, and we did it in Penguin, this artist bar, and then that was 2009. Then eventually, yes, in 2010 we realized that okay, so we want to make this sustainable. As much as we are rehearsing midnight till like late morning because we are having other jobs as actors and as artists, so we said okay, let's make this more sustainable so that we can get support. Let's incorporate ourselves, and then let's have a season lineup. We just like dive into the unknown because we don't know how to manage at that time. Even now, we're still like looking for that, and we are spoiled actors. We have to admit that. And then we did Haring Tubol, which is Uburwa. So you be talking about. Okay, so in 2010, we declared that nothing is more vulgar than the present regime. Convenient excuse for us now. A statement that we released for our first work, which is Haring Tubol, which was devised from Alfred Jarry's Uburwa. So it's about this king, about this couple who wants to kill the king, so they became the rulers, and then they kill everybody, they get everybody's money, and then they continue to kill the prince, and it goes on and on and on. And it was highly interactive, and we were asking audiences to dress up as priests and killing them, as senators, and we're killing them. And we were also involving, that was a start when, it was in 2010 that we realized that we don't have resources to produce posters or even prints, and that was the time when Facebook came accessible to everybody, and we were looking for new ways of engaging audiences online. So we had this. We were also having viral videos, inviting people to send videos to us saying "bear" 3 times, bear, 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 and then they get to play a part of the bear in our performance. So that's one way of engaging the audiences. It was a conscious decision to perform our first work with the artist community and with the academe, and with, of course, getting this much media, because as much as we are working on the peripherals, we acknowledge nonetheless that we have rules of engagement, proximity, coverage. How do we engage more people? Because if you think your work is relevant, then you have to make it. You have to engage more people, and you have to have coverage. Because if you think, because all of us think, I think that our works are important, so you have to engage as much. And engagement, proximity, coverage. Proximity by bringing our works closer to our audiences, because you have to understand that when we say theater in the Philippines, and you talk to ordinary audiences, say, you do musicals there, right? And Broadway musicals, or perhaps that's expensive. It's for some, it's still an elitist practice. It's an elitist undertaking. But they're saying, how can we be elitist when we're not paid that much? So anyway, so that's the general condition of the theater back then until now. We have to answer that in a while. So that was so engage these people so that when we go grassroots, when we go to these parking lots, we have a mechanism, a small mechanism, but of course this will be the people who will be like supporting the work and talk about the work and help you get support for the work. Then we change phase to acknowledge the dynamism and the range of works that we do. After Haring Tubol, we created a children's play So after doing a radical work, we were doing children's play. It's an adaptation of Animal Farm. So as you can see, instead of questioning the idea of totalitarianism, we were addressing the question of, we were addressing issues of democracy. Nothing is, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others in the context of democracy in the Philippines. Then from there, we shifted again from parking lots and these spaces. We went to barangays or these villages. We call them barangays here in this the slum areas in Manila, and we were we did Army Loves Juliet. It's a Jejemon adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, where we performed it in a barangay, in a basketball court, where in people's balconies, where people are also running with us. But we adapted the work to cater more specific to the site as we immersed, because we figured out that there were like emerging forms in the community. So the kids were doing hip hop battles, they were doing rap battles, and all these things, and we had to incorporate in the performance because we cannot. We had an excellent adaptation of Romeo and Juliet in Filipino, but when we bring it to the communities who are not used to watching these performances, we have to acknowledge that we have to change it. The language should change. So that's why we also incorporated some formats of face-to-face. That's the Jerry Springer of the Philippines. Are you familiar with that? Where families that go on camera and fight against each other on camera. So bash each other. Then from there, after engaging these barangays, we shifted again and created this, started working with university theaters and engaging this network of university theater companies and their audiences. But to our surprise, it got to engage more people. The next work, which was Batalla Royale, which had 4 runs in the last year. Batalla Royale is it's a loose adaptation of the Japanese cult novel Battle Royale, where we coined it a live action game. We changed the language. We didn't say that it's a theater production. We said it's a live action game. And so the idea, the story is that we have 40 students abducted by the government, and they were given 8 hours and weapons, 8 hours to kill each other, just one person alive. And it created a big wave of controversy, and it splitted people in terms of the idea of, because we were questioning morality and mortality, and in the middle of the performance, we asked audiences to decide for the fate of one of the characters, if they want him dead or alive, and it was almost a gladiatorial battle. And in the later runs, we were asked audiences if they want to stop the performance after seeing such violence. No backstage, people running while it's raining, and yeah. That was Batalla Royale. We created Facebook accounts for all the characters, and so all 40 characters have lives online. So audience were following them, and they know about them. So yeah, that's Batalla Royale. And then we shifted to our most recent works. After all this violence and gore, we shifted just this year into becoming a contemporary community theater and a contemporary theater community, where, because our realization with Batalla Royale, it's not that people don't want to join the theater, it's just that there are no platforms for people to participate. Because with Batalla, when we started doing pay what you can performances, surprisingly from 250 audiences, the next day we had 430, we had 900 audiences from different communities, non-regular theater goers, and we had like the gigsters, the online cosplayers joining us for the first time. Then we realized that we should be creating platforms where we can still pursue performance as the platform for discourse, but at the same time making it more accessible to more people, but at the same time, of course, having that responsibility for discourse. And so the most recent, and where we'll end, I guess, is Love. This is not yet a musical. Love is a crowdsourced performance where we ask people to submit works about love, anything about love. And you'd be surprised, we had 4 events to get that. We had a mass trial wedding where we married people, valid for 7 days, so that we can get their vows of love. And we had a speed dating event where we asked people to submit works about despair, forlorn love. We had a rap battle for people who would like to fight for love. So, and we have what's the other one? Sweet dating. A pool party to talk about heat, desire, fire, and love, or something like that. Yeah, and created a new myth about love. So we ask people to contribute online and on ground, and even to join the process if they can, because these are regular employees of some companies. So that's love.
So I think just to wrap this up, because we only have no more minutes. We have no more minutes. Just to bring it back to the idea of site specificity, just listening to how we transitioned from actually in 2009, before we established ourselves as a company, going out to these spaces because we couldn't afford to perform in theaters, in actual theaters. It's acknowledging the physicality of site, doing all these still classical or very conventional works within these alternative spaces, and in 2010 establishing ourselves as a site-specific performance company, suddenly crossing over to the social or institutional paradigm where we were conscious that we were going against the system, like going against, may that be the government, or just actually going against our classical roots in a way. By using theater of cruelty, exploring other forms, trying to find a new practice, a new process for ourselves, because going into site specificity called for that specifically. And eventually, with Romeo and Juliet, what we learned was that, we had to change language when we approach different cultures, because all sites are actually multicultural, and to be accessible is somehow calls for a certain adjustment, not necessarily bringing yourself, not necessarily, not bringing yourself down to their level, but actually acknowledging that they have another culture which you have to, a rich culture that you have to understand, and you can actually work with to make, and actually you have to work with them and not for them. And so just last year, and I think up to now, we transitioned to the idea that from considering ourselves as artists going to a specific place and offering them a performance, it's actually us going to specific spaces, creating a platform for the audiences and for ourselves to create. We've recently called ourselves a contemporary theater community, a contemporary community theater, considering that artists and audiences are all part of this community and are co-creatives, or collaborators. And in our most recent full production, Love This Is Not Yet a Musical, I think we started to explore the idea that the artists are facilitators and the audience are artists as well. So that's where Sipatlawin is at right now. And apart from doing performances, Sipatlawin, as we acknowledge, are made up of a core team of artist managers. So we're the ones who also manage our different programs. We have three different programs. We have the main wing, which consists of all the main productions. We have a season lineup of 4 adults productions. We have the children's wing, where we do works for and with children. We're the current storytellers, the resident storytellers of the Museo Pambata. We tour children's works, storytellings, etc. And then we have the Theater in a Backpack program, where, our gym for the heart. And we've been starting to create a new curriculum involving processes and ideas which aren't from theater, and trying to adapt all of these, opening ourselves up to different points of view. So, Sipatlawin in a nutshell.
So, okay. So, do you have any question about Sipatlawin's? Okay.
It's just based from the study that you wrote. You came from visual arts, diba? Yung comparison. But is it for the sake of the study? Was it part of the consciousness to not necessarily exclude? I don't know what the scope of your study was, to exclude protest theater or street theater. At the time that the 70s, 60s, it was also happening. And the happenings in bars, cafes in 60s. Yes.
Actually, in my actually in my study, I acknowledged that those works could also be considered as site specific, but generally it was in the time which they were considered more of mobile. So I decided, because even way before we had theater in the streets, Senacolo, etc., etc., and even the roots of theater, it was being performed in actual in found sites. So what I did was actually define site specificity in the arts as this movement, which was actually self-aware that this is site specificity. So it's if you look into all these particularities, there is somehow different with such awareness. There's actually a different mode of thinking and process that comes out, which is quite different from protest theater, etc., etc. But actually, I will send you a copy. It's for another discussion. We already have some. Yes, but it was a conscious decision to exclude those.
Just to clarify where you're coming from, and also from the history of where we're coming from, especially in theater. So for this, so in your argument, it's really about the awareness that they were doing something, or the interaction consciousness with the space that they're working with. That's why you chose the visual art movement, right?
I think I did. I actually acknowledged protest theater here, but generally it was because our practice wasn't really informed by those works. Although we were very aware that such works were very existing, we didn't really adapt what other methods, etc., to our practice. So what I actually did was enumerate what we were doing, clarify a certain thread of our evolution, and then searching how site specificity as an idea developed, as a movement developed, and then put those in parallel with each other.
As I was listening to the history of Sipatlawi, I was like thinking that probably this organization is something that socially penetrates cultures. But then, as you merge more with those cultures, the more you realize that there's a thin boundary or thin line, that there will always be no intersection between two cultures. So how can you address that line? For example, you have that the Jejemon, what's that play? The Jejemon something. But then, for those people who doesn't really know what Jejemon is or how those Jejemon came into being, how do you address? For example, in that case, how did you address for those Jejemon people to feel that they are represented in your play?
Actually, it wasn't about the approach. There was not about representing them or making them acknowledge that they are being represented and that they are being represented correctly. With Armio Loves Jules, what we did was we had a 1 month immersion with all of the with the communities there, involving the SK, what do you call them in English? Youth committee of the town. We did workshops with them, we interacted with them, and we sensed what the popular forms were, what was really popular to them, and used those as entry points, our means of engagement to involve in the production. It wasn't really representing. It wasn't a case of representation. It wasn't actually putting that. It was an immersive thing, and it was a work with them as well. So actually, we went there, and it wasn't an attempt to blend in, but it was we were aware that we were trying to collaborate with them. So in a sense, and even with our other works, it was actually a balance of being quite conscious that they had a particular culture that was different from ours, but it transitioned to having that challenge that what is universal in both of these cultures. Our aim was not to differentiate it, at first, of course, it's to acknowledge that, okay, what are these differences? And how do we deal with this? And how are we the same? How can we make something together that we can both understand? Yep.
Because I think that's a challenge always, the idea of representing or going to communities and offering something and, like being the messiah and knowing what should be done. Because I think that's an old way of doing work as an artist. But what we figured out is that the constant negotiation, we deal with that. We start with 6 actors on stage, 6 actors from CPAT, and we have 20 people from the community performing with us and doing their beats. Then at the end of the night, by the end of the performance, you have 40 people on stage because we don't know, because they're suddenly joining us. Okay, so that's a lot. But yeah, that's always the question. We always question even the ethics of immersing and being an ethnographer. As an artistic ethnographer, going to these communities, not really like, come on, we have something else, and this is how you should tell the story. So I think we're still in the process still of even creating a module for that, because even community theater, sometimes it's like going to the community and saying some old practices would be like going to the community and embodying them, or like representing them, making them watch you as you represent them, or something like that. So even that model is still in question for us.
I am not that familiar with the work of Sipat Lawin, though I did see Love Not, and I don't know who was it that commented that it's like being in a initiation of a frat. but yes, but I had that feeling to that somehow people were being herded into certain groups, and that these certain groups would have certain forms of expressing themselves and certain way of speaking, etc. And I've heard comments about Batalya Royale and the idea of mass hysteria, or again when you gather a group of people and somehow either prime them or instruct them to behave or behave in a certain manner. How do you process that? I mean, how do you try to let people or your audience, your participants, go beyond the
Okay.
Maybe before you answer the question, because I think all our questions are actually quite related. So then maybe the kind of an answering can actually be parang strategized in a different way, because it might be able to answer several layers of questions with it. So in fact, yun na nga, but connected to Ian, I think that has also, well, not only your anxiety, but also really partly has become our anxiety while we were doing this partnership of work with the Stereo Theater Commune. It looks like there is a need to really understand a new politics about what it means to engage a spectator. So, and every time you try to manipulate the kind of text or work that you do, thinking that you are not going to be trapped within that whole argument, that you are not necessarily setting them free, but actually, in fact, manipulating them even more. As you try to ask that question, you always find yourself in a trap or in a bind. So now, my question is, has it become a question for your company to really work with that? Have you seen several strategies that can allow a kind of freedom from that bind? Yes.
Let me start by thinking that all performances, be it site-specific or interactive or not, are framed manipulations, or let's call it curated experiences. In our experience, these are curated experiences. So, and it opens to this multiplicity or plurality of meaning making based on the context of each audiences. So, if one would say that it feels like it's in a frat mode, then so be it. Yes, maybe it is. Same way that what we're saying, that everything is curated, it's all a conscious decision. But how it will be perceived will differ based on the context of each audiences. And to open up that idea, as much as we curate it and we start engaging audiences, I think the question for us is that when we look at a work, how do we when we talk about engagement, how do we open the platform for possibilities of different meaning making or different interpretations of the work? Because as artists, like for example, for some they'd say that like Batalya Royale is hyper violent and it has that kind of like you're being forced, and you say exactly like it's curated that way, that you have to feel that way. And after that, the question is, how do we process that? For Batalya, we kept an online interaction and this ongoing negotiations and conversations with their audience who keep on coming back every performance or once in a while because they want to seek for answers. And as much as we say that the performance is the discourse, and it's not, and beyond that, yes, we can do a talk. Yes, we can tell you our different ideas about our own work, but it's also valid what you felt about the performance, and even to acknowledge that takes a lot of effort and a lot of mapping from our end. So, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering the question right, and if we're going there, because what we also realize is that when we talk about criticality, that's one thing that sometimes it gets the nerves out of me. When we talk about audience being critical, or some people are saying that your audiences are not critical enough, and then we're saying, wait, how can we judge an audience experience as not being critical if they don't know how to, if they cannot express or they cannot debate from a Marxist or modernist or postmodernist point of view? They don't know all these concepts. Is what they're feeling not valid as part of an experience of your performance? Because we think that those are valid responses too, not necessarily the way that it should be framed. Philosophically, academically, and sometimes we have audiences who are just there because they are being they're fans of the performance. They do these blogs and they go crazy over the work, and then as much as when we started, we say that okay, these are just really they're not thinking a lot, but but there is a depth over there. Then we start talking to them, and they're telling you about how it changed their perspective, and that's just the way that they're expressing. Because of course they're not regular theater goers, or they're coming from different communities too.
And I would just like to go back to the idea of anxiety. I think we stop being anxious of this idea of criticality when we involve the audiences in making the performance. I think that's a major shift from acknowledging that the performance is ours and we go there to present it to them, and then being anxious, did they get it? Did they get what we meant? Did they understand it? Blah, blah, blah. And eventually when they become part of the work because we embrace that, it wasn't an issue anymore. And from acknowledging that, thinking about a performance, addressing criticality as being able to think and articulate yourself, to actually acknowledging that the feeling is thinking as well. And if they felt such a way while viewing the performance, then that's valid.
I'm gaping for her.
I'm seeing two separate line of thoughts. I think now the whole idea, I'm seeing like more or less like a kind of a systemic solution into that kind of an anxiety as you are trying to discuss it. I think it has become then more and more important to create a relationship with the audience. So which means that you do not necessarily just create your work and expect people to come and expect them to understand or not understand and still articulate, but create a kind of a partnership really. And I think maybe what is important is to create a program wherein that kind of a partnership is created. So in that case, it becomes, maybe contemporary work should become really more multi-platform. So then maybe you have a workshop in the morning, then you have a show in the afternoon, then maybe in the evening there's a kind of a seminar or a conference about it, maybe a lecture. So because it looks like things have become more and more complicated because of the nature of multiplicity of that reality. But also aside from that, when you say that everything is curated, in the end, we're all saying that, of course, everything is manipulated. But in the end, isn't that what you really want the audience to know? That they can create their own meaning making, and if that's what we want them to do, isn't the traditional theater become the best way to actually really set that up? Because in that case, I become a disinterested audience wherein no one is telling me what to do, and then I can make up on my own and say, okay, fine, I like what I'm seeing, I'm staying. This one, I don't like what I'm seeing, I'm leaving this theater now. But I think that can only happen when you create a bigger relationship with them. Of course, it will not also automatically happen like a shift from a classical positioning like a theater. Maybe the theater should also, it has to be in a different kind of a theater. But more or less, that's the really, not only our question to you, but also question to this recent work, which might be seen on Saturday at 1, if you're still here. I mean, you know, there seems to be also kind of a gap wherein the actors are creating something to make sense of his own work. And just to do that entails so much. And then, of course, there's another layer of making sense for the audience. So it's like also a double bind of a work that we take in as actors. And how do we really, if not necessarily solve that, but expose that relationship and make the audience understand that there is that kind of a dynamics that happens. I am also trying to figure out, as you are figuring out my work. But is that a kind of a creative option that we want to make?
Just to add then, though, hopefully I don't forget. Just to add that, I think the question is also directed to the procedure. I mean, how do we create those performances? Entails kung ano yung mga what you exclude and what you include dictates your aesthetics, what dictates your procedure. So it's not necessary kasi you can always say the audience will always have their own take. But syempre, it goes for every work naman. It goes to every work. But I think what the question is directed to, procedural. What do you do that informs your work? Then you throw it out, or you present it to the audience. Because they could have a number of interpretations, and that's it. And secondly, I think there is, maybe anxiety might not be the most apt word for it. But I think there is something there when in fact you already laid out to us that there is that relationship with the audience. And if there is a relationship with the audience and that immersive a relationship, that close a relationship, there will be anxiety. There is a responsibility towards each other. So I think that is the basis of the anxiety that we are troubling ourselves with, because it's a very, very... Yeah.
Every contemporary artist's responsibility to be
anxious about that relationship. Yeah.
To embrace that.
Because if you cannot be anxious anymore and you just do the work, that to me maybe I'm sure that's not, maybe it was just just to make sure that we clarify the statements. Maybe that's not, I'm sure that's not what how you look at things.
Okay, when we say that we open our work to to a plurality of meaning, and we're talking about curated works. Of course, we are also. That's why we're saying it's a conscious decision. How we set like trigger points for people to feel a certain way, but of course it will differ based on their own context or where they're coming from, and that we acknowledge in the work. So yes, so I think there's like somewhere we were lost in translation over there, but yeah. So it's a curated performance. It's that opens up that. Yes, there's a complexity that it's not didactic in a sense because that's how traditional theater would do it. That they say that this is just how you should look at it.
See, when you say traditional theater, right? So if you open your audience up, I can project. So if you open up the audience to, you open up the audience to think that they are making choices and that they can choose. Then also in the end, you're also, when they go out, they said, already I chose something, and that's fine. But aren't you defeating then the point of them doing action after?
Yep.
See, so yun yung dichotomy, no, di ba? It's like you're going from Brecht to Artaud and whatever. So yun yung magkaibang points, no, na parang then you have like a spectator that is enlightened and that is empowered. They think they're empowered when they're in the theater, and then they go out, and it's not. Because you also gave choices to them that is curated, that is limiting in itself. Do you understand? So that's why I kind of agreed to him when he said, exactly.
Like, I made a choice here, so it's like a kind of a superficial choice I made during the show, and it feels like
Or
That's
maybe
why
it was
you lead them to that. I mean, that's why you lead them. You simmer to that.
We're
But
probably
as
not
artists,
arguing about it, just, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Clarify
Exposing the
that.
complexity.
No, it's just I just need to point that out also because you're saying that our audiences, you emancipate your audience by giving them choices, by being more active, and that's a solution to how our audiences are dwindling in theater. But maybe it's also not, because they also need to distance themselves from the work as well.
So you'd be surprised, like, we have audiences responding to our work, say, after a month or 3, because you need that. Initially, in our initial engagement, which is the performance, of course, we simmer it down to these trigger
And I think
points.
the practical solution is the multi-platform, because after the show, people can still air out what they think about it and parang link into the performance.
Yeah, that's why you still have online interactivity, or sometimes they go back to the performances. Yes, but yes, when we say that we curate them to having these choices in the end, like it's still leading them towards this. But as artists, as practicing artists, acknowledging that they will look at the work differently, and I think the genius there, or the brilliant thing to do, is for you to be able to preempt, or not even preempt, or like for you to be able to determine that eventually you are leading this audience to these choices.
I mean, in the last experience I had with the show, I had this feeling of being manipulated so much that I walked out again. And so in the end, I'm saying, yeah, maybe, but I wanted to see more of me. Parang ganon. But of course, that's also an imposition, right? So you that's the kind of complexity I'm seeing. And even the choices that were being made, like let's say, I think if we want to go into the details of it, when you have an actor doing this to you, parang, and you're inside the space, and then you want to stay, and you're not given an option to stay, then in the end, it feels like there is no choice. You're like asked to like follow rather
That's
than
the idea there.
yeah.
To follow here,
Yeah.
here, and
Yeah.
then think. After
But
that,
there doesn't seem to be a space to think, because in that whole
Yeah, but it's an ongoing experience. As much as you say that people don't have choice to leave the theater, you left. People can leave, and it's the same as when you're in a space where you can walk out of the performance if you think it's too manipulated, because it is plotted in such a way that it will make you feel like, okay, I'm going here, okay, the next, and it has those wings in the eye, as we call it. We plant those bombs to make people lead to wherever we want them to go. But at the same time, of course, that's where multiplicity will come in towards the end, and it will take time. And yes, it's right that it doesn't happen in the performances right away, the performance space. It will sometimes it's after the show, or that's why we also don't do open forums after the performances, because it's too much. It's experiential theater, and you were like running, and you were doing this adrenaline rush, and for you to distance and really understand what happened to you.
Sometimes it gets overwhelming for the audiences because even with our friends, because usually, we do not do discussions right after the performance because we know that most people are just emotionally overwhelmed at the time. That if you ask them, what do you think? They're just, but then if you ask them, what did you feel? Then they start talking about what they went through, the particular stories, etc.
Probably why I have this all of a sudden this kinesthetic idea that an audience who's seated down has a more position to actually choose than an audience who's moving into something and then being led into something else. And then of course, then if I will have to choose which audience I want to have now, I don't know, all of a sudden it's hitting me now, then I'd probably just let them sit down. Maybe it takes more space to listen than being led.
I think we're talking about different practices because the way we do our works is different from the way you do your work, and etc. etc. And I think it's very different. I mean, this is not what we do is not a rejection of an old system. Like it also works, and we're trying to make sense of how we do it. So and it's not about choosing which type of audience we want, just but making them sit and saying that people who go to theaters and sit down and watch are more of a thinking audience. It's not actually going there. Yes, it's addressing that there is a difference and that how we direct audiences, because I think people even in unconventional setups have a choice whether they watch or they sleep or they whatever, or they listen or they don't, and it depends on engagement as well. Like if you engage that person, then that person will watch. So I think that's something that a certain idea that we also adapt in our performance. Yeah.
Sorry, just it's just to put into context. I think all our arguments are stemming from what we think you're trying to do. I think that, and syempre, in our experience, it's a critical way. It's a creatively critical way of.
I want you to watch that play we're doing and tell us.
Yeah, yeah, right. but I think just to put.
We're changing it. It's completely different.
But then I guess you should be also very careful when you say traditional theater and what, because there's nothing more traditional than how Plato would define it, that because you say emotion, then there's a catharsis to it, then there's a cathartic experience involved when you say, di ba, yun. So that is what when you ask them about what they're thinking, they can't think, right? But they're asking what they felt, then they know what they felt. So I guess it's just a lot of big words sometimes that we throw around, and that's kind of, let's just be more careful with that.
Yeah. So how do we call it?
Definition of terms.
Well, to me, it's okay, I think, to use the terms, and then, of course, create a platform where the
Terms are being discussed, which is what exactly we're doing now. Yeah.
I think, hello guys. I am a language, actually I am from PUP and I'm studying AB English. So if there's things about semantics, I'll call it here. Miss Hamias, I've watched her Apples in the Desert a long time ago, and that was old. So I'll just, tradition as old, an old man, while the new ways as a child. So in short, El Viejo and El Niño. so that we cannot, you know, oh, there's tradition, because the new age can be a tradition in later years. So let's call them old and let's call them new.
I think what we're trying to say naman is that we don't want to be dichotomous in our own approach of things. I think that's one of the things we are supporting. That's why we're doing this kind of forum. We're not saying yes or no. We're saying there is so much there to work on. It really, the kind of work that we are doing now as contemporary artists is really so much more complicated, I think, than when we were before, I think. I might be incorrect, but I mean, you know.
I mean, we also have a problem. I remember a particular conversation where we were trying to define what independent was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or what experimental theater is
Yes,
supposed to be.
supposed to be.
Because of all our expectations.